Hey there. Welcome to Psalms in a Minute. I am Kelly Vanderwoudy. Today's video, we are tackling the 10,000-foot view of the 15 verses of Psalm 17. Psalm 17 is a psalm of prayer. It's a psalm of petition. It's a psalm of hope in the midst of chaos. And it comes to us from David. So stick around. Join me for this psalm in a minute. Thanks again for joining me on Psalm 17 in a minute. We'll get to the psalm here shortly. I've lost count on what take this is. I've got a lot of things to say about Psalm 17, and I'm struggling to get it all in a minute or less. We'll eventually get there. But before we get there, before we try yet again, some of the things I've been working on. I was commissioned to do a large cutting, charcuterie board for someone. It was about 23, almost 24 inches long, 9 inches wide. It was curly maple, walnut, and cherry. Really beautiful, very clean, just very simple as well. Somebody asked for me to do some coasters. I did some coasters for us. And so they wanted 10 coasters with 2 holders. And they just said just some simple lines of different colors so that they look different. I still need to put cork on the back so that they don't slide all over the place because it is pretty smooth, but mainly so they don't scratch up a table. And I still have to do the holders, 2 holders for them. But the big project was a cutting board, and it was this cutting board. So this is walnut, curly maple, and this is bloodwood. And you can see the color variation in the video, but only in person do you really start to see the greens and the yellows and the reds and the oranges. There's even a peach, and there's blue and gray in here. And those colors happen. I don't know why, but those colors tend to happen better and more vibrant when it's air dried and not kiln dried. Most of the wood that we get is kiln dried because it's faster. You can just, however long it takes. This was air dried for about, I think it was about 8 years they had it, and I was blessed enough to get my hands on it. So this type of cutting board is one that I want to do. That'll be on my website. Maybe not necessarily the walnut with these colors, but if you wanted something with cherry, so a nice little red, or the curly maple, which is white, and then some other combo of the strips, that is absolutely doable. But I love walnut, and especially this color of walnut. This is also what's called a face grain, not an end grain. The end grain would be of using of that. A lot of people like the end grain. A lot of people like the face grain. I just chose to do face grain on this one. The first cutting board I ever did was an end grain, and while it's easier on your knife, lasts a little bit longer, I think, as well. It is a lot of work because that end grain, those fibers are a pain to sand and sand and sand some more. So, which is why when you buy an end grain cutting board, you're going to spend more money because it's all extra time and time. So, this one actually, I think, is claimed already. I posted it to my Facebook page, and somebody reached out to me and said, I want it. So this specific one is not for sale, but this style I can make for you. So you can reach out to me. You can look for VW's Woodworking on Facebook. There will eventually be a website. So yeah, the other thing. So I'm hoping I was hoping to today have some white oak and start doing some Adirondack chairs that I've been asked to build. But unfortunately, we are a house of COVID. And so we have 1 confirmed case. We're waiting on the other 3 to come back. I am not confirmed, but I feel like I have it. I'm having respiratory issues and other symptoms. We are boosted and shotted it, but clearly that doesn't mean you won't catch it. Hopefully that just means it lessens the severity. So I am drained. I just don't have the energy, and so I don't know how much I'm going to end up being able to do, but I would like to at least get to a point to where maybe I can shoot a video of me working on something and post that to the YouTube channel for the sawdust portion, instead of just showing you things that I've done. But we'll get there. We'll see how I feel. We'll go from there. But at this point, it's staying hydrated, and so for me, it's drinking bubbly. whatever, and just trying to feel better. But you came here for Psalm 17 in a minute. Let's see if we can get to this in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's begin. These 15 verses are very similar to Psalm 16 in a lot of ways, and yet very different as well. They both focus on many of the same things, but Psalm 17 comes from the midst of chaos and enemies and deliverance that David needs. That's why Psalm 17 is a prayer. We don't know where David is or what he's going through, but in the midst of this falling into his knees, he needs deliverance. And so it's broken up into two sections, verses 1 through 12, and then 13 through 15. The first 12 verses about the immediacy of God's work, like now, and then those last 3 verses switch to the look of the hope of the future, which is encouraging. So what does all this mean? The majority of this text is about the reality of David's situation, while the last bit, especially verse 15, is about the joy and peace and hopefulness that comes when God is in the presence of your life. So where do we go? Twice David asked for God to hear his prayer, because when you're in the realm of hell and enemies and destruction, that's what you do. You plead to God for deliverance. You pray. The interesting thing is that David is worried about his own integrity, his own actions, his own words, so much so that he begs God to listen to him. So much so that there's this feeling that he is justifying whatever he's done, and that God knows all he's done is holy and good and right. So is David innocent? Maybe, maybe not. But the text feels like David is justified in whatever he has done, and that whatever he has done deserves vindication from where he is. But his hope is not in this moment, but the righteous God who redeems him whenever that will be. And that is your psalm in a minute. Booyah! Oh, Lord have mercy. So that was Psalm 17. Stick around. If you want to hear that slower, I'm now going to do that. Or if you feel you got everything, I tend to add a little bit more words when I go slower. I just do. I don't know why. But if you want to skip ahead, you can. I will put, I think right around here, the timer. You can forward ahead in the video to jump ahead to the Christ or the what does that mean for us? Typically, we try to find the Christ. How does this point to Christ? And so we'll do that here shortly. But first, what I just said at a slower pace. So I can turn that off. These 15 verses are very similar to Psalm 16 in a lot of ways, and yet it's very different as well. They both focus on many of the same things, but Psalm 17 comes from the midst of the chaos and enemies and deliverance that David needs. This is why Psalm 17 is a prayer in the middle, from the middle of the enemy. We don't know where David is or what he's going through, but in the midst of it and falling to his knees in needs of deliverance. And so that's what he does. It's broken up into two sections of verses 1 through 12 and then verses 13 through 15, with the first 12 verses being about the immediacy of God's work, like now, and then the last 3 verses switch and look to the hope of the future in an encouraging way. So what does all this mean? The majority of the text is about the reality of David's situation, while the last bits are about the hope that he has, with that final verse, verse 15, being about the joy and peace and hopefulness and goodness of God and the presence in our lives. So where do we go? Twice David asked for God to hear his prayer, because when you're in the midst of hell or enemies or destruction, then that's what you do. You plead to God for deliverance. You pray. The interesting thing is that David is worried about his own integrity, his own actions, his own words, so much so that he almost begs God to listen to him. So much so that there's this feeling that he's justifying whatever he's done, so that God knows it was all done in a holy manner or for holy ways. Is David innocent? Maybe, maybe not. But the text feels like David is justified in whatever he's done, and that whatever he's done deserves vindication from wherever he sits. But the hope is not in this moment, but in the righteous God who will redeem him whenever that will be. So that is your psalm in a minute at a slower pace. Okay, so what does all this mean? As a Christian, where do we go with this, right? This prayer is full of urgency. And listen, we can have a conversation about how righteous was David, how holy was he. He wasn't, right? We know David wasn't. Nobody is. But this isn't about David's righteousness or holiness. We can't pull the history of David into a very specific prayer and say, hold on, David, you are not who you say you are. Because that's not the context of this text. We don't know what the context of this text is. But what we do know is that this is about a child of God in the midst of need, and his comfort being found in the response by God or to God. that there is all this destructiveness around him, all these enemies, all this deceitfulness, all these things happening to him, which, again, we don't know what led to this or why he's here or what all is going on. But David is in need, and so he falls to his knees and prays. He sends up this prayer. So as I read this, for me, this isn't so much as here's Christ in the text. I'm not going to force that situation in. Or this is how Christ does this. I mean, we can have conversations about Christ in his time of needs, praying and all those kinds of things. But this is David's simple prayer. This is a need. This is David's space into whatever chaos and destruction and enemies and lies all around him, and has nothing to do, no way to respond. For David, the only thing he can do is pray. So as I read this, this reminds me that we are to pray, that we can do all that we can do. We can respond in life how we respond. We can have the most righteous of responses to people around us, but we cannot control how they respond to what we have done or what we do. And at some point, I can only do what I can do. And when we come to that realization, when we recognize that everything that I've done is not stopping this around me, what do? We pray. When we recognize the harm still comes at us, we pray. When we see the enemies surrounding us, the lies being spread about us or others, we pray. Why? Because we desire to live lives worthy of God's calling to us. And so when we try to act in righteous ways, when we try, as David talks, when we try to not live by deceitful lips, as David describes, when our hearts are in the place God calls them to be, the reality is that that's not how other people act. And we can't control how they act. And a lot of times how we act, even those holy ways, pushes against the ways of this world, and people just become even angrier or harmful. And that's not how we're supposed to act. And how we act is not how an evil world responds. Christians are supposed to live by those rules of heaven, those standards of God. But to not believe in God and his holy ways means that you can do whatever you want. And so when someone does whatever they want as you try to live by Christ's holy standards, we're in for a hot mess. And we can't fix hot mess. Only God can. Yes, Christ is the ultimate answer to the hot mess of this world. We can have that conversation. You can preach that. And he has and will deal with it. But until that day comes, where we try to live into lives of goodness and love and truth and sacrifice in a world that wants nothing to do with that, when we meet with the holy ways and righteous ways we're supposed to live by, with the broken, sinful ways of the world that wants nothing to do with it, we clash. And when we clash, we recognize we can't do anything about it. So what do? We pray. And we know that when we live by God's rules here on earth, when we act in the ways we're supposed to, even in the good times and clearly the bad times, as David is in, we pray because we know that our voice is lifted to heaven and God hears it. That is your Psalm 17 in a minute. Thanks again for joining me. I hope this was encouraging and helpful. A couple things in closing. I say it every time. Read the Bible. Read Psalm 17. Read David's prayer here. And dive into it for yourself. This is me giving you a little bit of context and backstory, but this is also me wrestling with it as well and getting to that point. So read the Bible yourself. Don't take my word for it. I am just Kelly in Fort Collins. The Bible is God's unfolding love of us through his son, Jesus Christ, though. It's a Bible about Christ. And so read it, get to know it, draw closer to Him. Also, make sure you hit the subscribe button, follow along, and get notifications on any uploads and future psalms and woodworking things. You can scroll down and you can see other ways to follow me on social media and whatnot. I have 2 books you can purchase. You can find those on Amazon. And I think that's about all that I have. As usual, be kind, be considerate, be compassionate towards one another, be full of love and grace and mercy. But before you go, your sawdust tip of the week. There's one of them. What I wanted to say is wear a mask. Even when you have a good dust collection system, and I've got a shop vac, I've also got a much better dust collector. Even when I use those and I hook those up to my saws or my sanders, whatever, my planer, it doesn't matter. Throw on a mask. My shop vac can only do so much. My bigger vac is much better, but it doesn't get all the particles out of the air. And those dust particles and the oils in the wood, those types of things can wreak havoc on your lungs and your system. Everything is supposed to work nicely and function together. And so when one goes out of whack, it affects all of the rest of you. I have 2 different masks. I have this one. I also have a smaller one or without these filters. I don't use it as often as I should, and I know that. But use one. Use a mask. Protect yourself. Your health is important. Wear a mask. That's your sawdust tip for the week. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next week. God bless.